I talked last night, for those of you who were here, about Abraham Lincoln. And if you were there, you'll recall that one of the points I made was that his changing and unique role as Commander-in-Chief in the American Civil War was directed in part by virtue of the fact that the Civil War sat on a kind of historical pivot point. And part of that is technological. The war changed dramatically from a kind of war that might have been recognized by Sir Walter Scott, where in the 15th century, for example, lines of soldiers would line up across from one another and say, "You, sir, fire first." "Oh, no, I insist. You fire first." That kind of warfare had pretty much disappeared from the globe by the middle of the 19th century, and technology had created a new template of war with all of the new instruments of death that we see manifested in many cases for the first time during the Civil War. And one aspect of the American Civil War was the introduction of what scholars today tend to call hard war. In the old days, we might refer to that as total war. But as Karl von Clausewitz reminded us, again back in the 19th century, total war is an abstract concept that never really exists. There are always some limitations to war. And so scholars have fallen back on this new term of hard war. But the Civil War clearly was, for Americans in particular, as close as we have ever gotten to that abstract phenomenon of total war. And there were several aspects of that. Most students of the war might immediately jump to Sherman's March. Kind of becomes a shorthand reference to the way war had evolved from what it had been in 1861 to what it became by 1865. Or Phil Sheridan's rampage through the Shenandoah Valley in 1864, where his orders, verbal orders to be sure, but orders nonetheless, were to so devastate the Shenandoah Valley that a crow flying across it would have to carry its own provender with it. And he followed those orders. Or Jubal Early's campaign up into Pennsylvania, not just in 1863, but particularly in 1864, where he rode into a couple of Pennsylvania towns and said, "Give me $500,000 in cash or I'll burn your town." And did. That's not the kind of war most Americans conceived of, even in 1861, but had been forced to accept by 1864. And one aspect of that war was the blockade, which at the time, and to some still, seems like a particularly inhumane form of conflict, at a time when the concept of war was that armies fought one another, not that armies fought the society, the culture, the town, the people, the citizens. But the rules of warfare were bending, and not just because of technology. They bent because in this war, as in all wars, the war itself created a kind of momentum. And all wars will do that. Almost any war that I can think of or that you can think of that began with high-minded principles and objectives created a momentum that led to unforeseen and often unfortunate aspects of that conflict. And consequently, before that American Civil War was over, the civil populations of both sides, in the Confederacy to be sure, but in the Union as well, experienced the kind of sacrifice that this conference was organized to highlight. It needs to be mentioned that while naval blockades had been a part of warfare for literally for centuries, certainly well back into the age of sail, this one, the one in the American Civil War, was different. The naval blockade that Britain's Navy, the Royal Navy, imposed on Napoleon's continental empire in the late 18th century and early 19th century, or on the American colonies themselves during the American Revolution and subsequently in the War of 1812. Those blockades were designed to prevent your opponent's navy from getting to sea. You were blockading his warships Just as in the war on land, where armies fought one another rather than the society that gave them birth, so too did naval warfare, and blockade in particular, focus on the idea of defeating your opponent's armed naval forces. Horatio Nelson's goal in blockading Toulon or Brest during the Napoleonic Wars were designed to keep French warships in their harbors so that the British could control the seas and use the broad avenue of the world's oceans to attack French colonies or maintain their trade, or in fact both, and eventually to defeat those French warships, as Nelson finally did in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. The Union blockade of the Confederacy was different. There were no Confederate fleets to bottle up in their harbors, nor was the purpose of the blockade to confine the handful of rebel privateers that soon disappeared from the sea anyway for lack of ports where they could send their prizes. Instead, the purpose of the Union blockade of the Confederacy was to seal off the entire southern coast to trade foodstuffs, supplies, materials. It was, in Lincoln's word, to prevent the entrance and exit of vessels from every port in all of the seceded states. That's a dramatic, frankly astonishing ambition, for the Confederate coastline was enormous, much longer than the Union coastline by a factor of 3. It ran from Alexandria, Virginia, down the Potomac River, around the Capes of the Carolinas, down to Florida, around that double coast, and then all along the Gulf Coast of the Confederacy, all the way to the Rio Grande at Matamoros, Mexico. 3,500 miles of it. And to close that coast to shipping of any kind meant stopping peaceful trade as well as warships. It meant economic warfare, designed to demonstrate to the rebellious states that they were dependent, after all, on the whole Union, and that their experiment in self-government and separateness was simply not going to work. Lincoln's blockade declaration, which he announced on April 19, 1861, only 5 days after Fort Sumter, was the first strategic decision made by the Union in this war. It began very modestly, of course, by necessity, but it grew in size and in scope until it involved over 500 ships and 100,000 men, totals that eclipsed the entire size of all the navies that had ever served under the American flag from the time of its founding up to 1861. Over the course of the 4 years, those men and ships captured more than 1,500 blockade runners, valued at more than $30 million. Now today in the Pentagon, $30 million is a rounding error, but in the 19th century that was significant money. In spite of that, the blockade never did seal off the South entirely, never did fulfill the goal that Lincoln announced when he declared it. The Confederacy managed to import enough war material to sustain her armies. Southerners like to point out that the Confederacy never lost a battle because of the blockade, and that's probably true enough. Northern newspapers at the time, and some historians since, have pointed out the porousness, the ineffectiveness of the blockade of the Confederacy. Not only did daring blockade runners run in and out of southern ports with apparent impunity, many of them coming here to Wilmington, North Carolina, but that it's not apparent, or at least it's not demonstrable, that the Confederacy suffered very much from material shortages because of the blockade. But in fact, the Confederacy did suffer from shortages, not necessarily in rifles or muskets or even gunpowder. But the tales of barefoot soldiers in Butternut are not entirely mythical. They survived on meager rations. They didn't run out of bullets. They didn't run out of gunpowder. And when they suffered privation, it was often because of the breakdown in internal transportation. Not that the ships couldn't bring supplies into the ports, but that the internal railroad system had broken down. And that's true too. But the blockade did have an impact, and I'm going to talk about that more particularly toward the end. But let me first focus on the question of what it was. What were the characteristics of this blockade? What was it like for those who maintained it? What was it like for those who tried to break through it? And did the sacrifices of the blockaders, or the sacrifices of the civil society who were victimized by the blockade, did they make any difference in the outcome of the war? There was, first of all, a legal dimension to all of this. Let me address that first. According to the international laws of war, and of course there's the old joke about international laws made by the winners, and that's certainly true, but there were protocols that had been established by international courts in Europe consequent to the Napoleonic Wars about blockades. And according to those protocols, a naval blockade was not legally binding on neutrals. Neutrals did not have to obey blockade restrictions unless the blockading power actually established a physical force off the coast to prevent vessels from getting in and out. You couldn't just say that the coast was blockaded. You actually had to do it. And in those 3,500 miles of Confederate coastline, there were 189 harbors and navigable river mouths where ocean-going ships could come in and go out and pick up goods and bring in supplies. 189. So the ships of neutral powers were fully within their rights to try to break the blockade. That was allowed. So Lincoln's first job after saying that there is one is to prove that that in fact is a true statement. And that's going to be hard to do. At the time of that declaration, the United States Navy consisted of about 40 ships, most of which were overseas on distant station patrol and unavailable to the blockade. So the first step in making this pronouncement a reality is obviously to dramatically expand the size of the Navy itself. And it's going to have to be done at the same time that the Union forces are building up to conduct a war along a 1,000-mile front against a rebellious society. Many observers on both sides of the Atlantic didn't think this was possible. It simply could not be done. But even if it could, there's another legal problem, for Lincoln's pronouncement of a blockade could easily be considered a de facto declaration of war, a kind of recognition of the existence of the Confederacy, at least as a belligerent, if not recognition of the Confederacy as a state. Throughout the war, Lincoln was very consistent in insisting the Confederacy did not exist. You did not secede because secession is illegal. You are still part of the United States. Your unwillingness to obey the laws makes you subject to punishment and imprisonment perhaps, but you're not a separate country. You are part of the United States. Well, if that's the case, how can you declare a blockade? Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, pointed this out to him and warned Britain as well, and France and other European states, that any recognition of the Confederacy as a belligerent by those powers would be considered an unfriendly act. And yet, the declaration of a blockade seemed to contradict that policy. How can you blockade a country that does not legally exist? Well, whatever the long-term consequences of these legal complications, the most immediate problem was to make that blockade effective somehow. Gideon Welles, who was Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, the erstwhile postmaster from Hartford, Connecticut, he of the long white beard that Lincoln referred to as Father Neptune. Gideon Welles dispatched the few available ships that he had, and it was no more than 12, down to the southern coast with orders to stop trade from going in and out, as if that were possible, and simultaneously embarked on a crash program to acquire new ships. And all that gave the U.S. Navy a total of about 100 ships by the end of the first 6 months, most of them steamers. But that's still only a fraction of what's going to be needed. Remember, there are 189 ports, and one ship per port is not going to be enough. You're going to need several, particularly here at Wilmington, where you might need a dozen or 24 or more. Most of the ships acquired came from converting existing merchant steamships into warships. Fairly easy process in the 19th century. You couldn't do this today, of course. take a container ship and put a flight deck on it and say, there's an aircraft carrier. But you could do that in the 19th century. You had to strengthen the decks enough that it would hold the weight of the naval guns. You had to move some of the steam lines down below the water level. You had to expand the crew size so you could have a crew big enough to man those guns. It was a lot cheaper than building warships from scratch. And although these converted warships wouldn't really be able to stand up perhaps to the warships of Britain and France, they were plenty strong enough to stop unarmed merchant ships from coming into Wilmington, or so they hoped. By the end of 1861, the Union Navy had they had 264 warships listed in their register, and the blockade was at least making a step toward becoming a reality. Well, what was it like to serve in the blockade? The Union sailors who kept the watch, fed the engines, manned the guns on these blockading vessels from Virginia to Texas found that life at sea was pretty much an endless tedium of routine. It was Groundhog Day. They spent interminable days focused intently on the horizon to see if there's a little speck of smoke that might indicate a ship trying to come in, or looking into the harbor to see if ships there might be getting up steam for an attempt to break out. But generally, day after day and week after week and often month after month passed with no sign of any ship anywhere. And soon time began to hang heavy on the blockaders. On most such days, the familiar routines of shipboard life measured the passing of time. 6 a.m., orders to lash up, turn to, sounded throughout the ship, sanded down the decks. Dinner was piped, 4, and then the watches changed, and eventually the sky turned to pink and then to indigo as the night came on. Now things might get more interesting, because it was almost always at night that blockade runners tried to violate the blockade. In the middle of a moonless night, a cloudy night, time of a new moon, perhaps in a misting rain. Remember, all the ships are blacked out because you don't want to give away your own location, so it's absolutely pitch dark, very little ambient light whatsoever, and here are these lookouts staring out into that darkness, and is that a somewhat darker shadow creeping through the... I can't tell. And then fumbling for lights, they might set off what were called constant flares, red and green lights that in a certain pattern would ask questions, friend or foe, and you had to give the countersign, and if the countersign were not forthcoming, then they'd fire a rocket into the air. Well, that got things started. All the sailors would come tumbling up from down below, racing up the ladders to cast loose the guns and staring out in the night. And yes, that was a darker, but is that one of ours or one of theirs? If you've got 4 or 5 or 6 or 12 blockade ships off places like Charleston or Wilmington, you don't want to shoot into your own ship, so you have to be pretty sure, and by the time the guns go off, that bright orange stab of light blinding everybody for just a minute in the complete darkness, and then the ship was gone, and that was it. Back to tedium again. Most of the time, the ships successfully ran through the blockade, more often than not. Let me cite one rather typical example. This one's off Charleston on June 23rd, 1862. It was 3 o'clock in the morning in that pitch black pre-dawn darkness on the deck of the side wheel steamer USS Keystone State, named obviously for Pennsylvania. And the lookout saw this dark shadow moving out there and fired the rocket and manned the guns. But it was a ship going out, not coming in. So they slipped the anchor and took off after it. And now it became a race. And after 3 hours and more than 40 miles, 2 of the 3 Union ships pursuing this blockade runner gave up. They were falling behind. They couldn't keep up. Blockade runners tended to be built for speed as much as anything else. So now only the Keystone State, which had a reputation for speed, was speeding out after it, and the chase continued. When the sun came up, the commander of the Keystone State, a fellow named William Leroy, identified it as the Nashville, a notorious blockade runner. Oh boy, this is going to look good when I capture this ship. And he ordered the coal heavers to redouble their efforts. To lighten ship and gain speed, he threw all his anchors and anchor chain over the side. He pumped all his fresh water over the side, which meant he'd have to head back for port before he could rejoin the blockade. But this was his chance, and he wasn't going to let it get away. And the Keystone State started to gain. Well, on board the fleeing Nashville, those officers and men are desperate too. They threw their entire cargo over the side. This was the whole point of running out, and of course the cargo is almost exclusively cotton. The price of cotton had doubled again, and then doubled 3 more times. It was virtually white gold by late 1862, but over the side it went. And then they began tearing apart the deck cabins and burning the wood to gain more speed and more steam, and the Nashville pulled ahead again. And for more than 300 miles, the two ships pursued each other across the ocean at full speed. And finally, after an all-day chase, with each ship squeezing every drop of speed out of its engines that it could, the Nashville slipped into a squall, changed course, and disappeared. And when the Keystone State came out of the weather, it was gone. Eventually, by the way, she reached Abaco in the British Bahamas, and Leroy, vastly disappointed, returned to the blockade of Charleston. Now, statistically, this goes down into the books as an escaped blockade runner. But of course, it was an escaped blockade runner that didn't get any cotton out, so I'm not sure whether that goes on the Confederate side of the ledger or the Union side of the ledger. There were moments of relief in this kind of schizophrenic existence of endless boredom and then frenetic activity. Periodically, a supply ship would show up from Port Royal or places north and bring coal and food and fresh water. The whole process of underway replenishment, UNREP as they call it in the Navy today, kind of was born in the Civil War need to maintain the blockading squadrons off the southern coast. And the Confederates, what was their life like? What sacrifices did they have to make? Of course, it was mocked as an example of Yankee hubris, how typical of them to say they're going to blockade the entire coastline of the South. Ha ha, like you could do such a thing. And as time passed and the blockade became more efficient, Southerners began to feel the pinch, and the comments became less mocking and more accusatory. This was making war on civilians, on women, on children, denying food, clothes, sustenance, medicine to the people of the South. How cruel Yankees could be. And in response, the South had to turn to blockade running, what Stephen Wise called the lifeline of the Confederacy. Early on, when the blockade was still porous because so few ships were available to maintain it, opportunistic blockade runners made enormous profits running in and out of the blockade for their financial investors. But it was all unorganized and ad hoc. There were a few Southerners who argued that the blockade should be organized and managed as a government undertaking. What do we need? What do we need to bring in? Let's make a list and provide these to the skippers. But that ran contrary to the anti-government laissez-faire philosophy of Southern society, and both Secretary of War James Seddon and Secretary of the Navy Stephen Mallory, burdened as they were with fighting a war for the South's very existence, decided to leave blockade running to the entrepreneurs. That was a lost opportunity for the South, because instead of bringing in the kind of materials the Confederacy so desperately needed, they brought in what would bring the highest profit margin. Now, there are cliches, and we've all heard them, that the blockade runners are bringing in bonnets and perfume and hoop skirts and all that stuff. It's not quite literally true, but it is true that the market and not the needs of Confederate armies largely determined the content of the cargo in the blockade runners through about early 1863. The general pattern of the trade began mostly in England, sometimes in Belgium, occasionally in France, with legitimate and therefore perfectly legal cargoes that were entrusted to be brought to one of several ports nearer to the United States. The most popular were St. George, Bermuda, Nassau in the Bahamas, and Havana, Cuba. And there the cargoes were transferred from these big, lubberly transoceanic ships into small, narrow, fast, steam-powered blockade runners. Masts would all be stripped down. They'd be painted a gray, kind of a mottled gray, to blend with the sea as much as possible. Now, once these vessels were underway and headed for the Confederacy, now they are subject to capture under the rules of the blockade. Every speck on the horizon was a potential foe, and they maneuvered to avoid discovery. Skippers also tried to time their voyages so they'd arrive just off the coast late dusk, so they could make that run in at night. And as the example here, I'll cite the experience of a blockade runner that came into here, Wilmington. It comes from a memoir of Thomas E. Taylor, who served as what was known as a supercargo. This is essentially the owner's agent on board of the English-built, steel-hulled blockade runner Banshee. And he recorded his feelings as that ship made its first run from Nassau into Wilmington in the spring of 1863. This is Taylor. "Nothing I have ever experienced can compare with it. Hunting, pig sticking, steeplechasing, big game shooting, polo, I have done them all. All have their thrilling moments, but none can approach running the blockade." The Banshee left Nassau for the 3-day run in the second week of May 1863. May 1863, you'll recall, in the immediate aftermath of Chancellorsville, and while Lee and his armies are moving up the Shenandoah Valley, heading for a crossing into Pennsylvania that will culminate at the Battle of Gettysburg. So it's a key moment in the history of the Confederacy and indeed the Civil War. The Banshee was lucky enough not to see any other ship during its run in toward Wilmington. And as it approached the North Carolina coast, people began to get a little edgy, because that's where, in Taylor's words, a swarm of blockade runners without lights and a coastline so low and featureless that, as a rule, the first intimation we had that it was near was the dim line of white surf that barely appeared through the darkness. The Banshee's captain was named Jonathan Steele, and he gave orders to show no lights at all, blacked out, of course, like the blockading ships themselves, and absolute silence. So this is Taylor again. "We steamed on in silence, except for the stroke of the engines and the beat of the paddle floats," almost like, your heart beating in nervousness, "which in the calm of the night seemed distressingly loud." Suddenly the pilot grabbed Taylor's arm. "There's one of them," he said, pointing. Now Taylor looks out into the dark. He can see nothing at all. And then gradually, as he strained looking in that direction, his words, "a long black object on our starboard side lying perfectly still." As I mentioned, the Yankee blockading ships, they're also completely black, and their lookouts are staring out into the dark the same way Taylor is. Would they see the Banshee creeping in? And then a moment later, the pilot whispered again, "Steamer on the port bow." And there's another one. Then another dead ahead, and the captain orders, "Stop her." Engines stop. Now they're adrift, absolute silence, complete darkness, just waiting. But that darkness won't last forever. Eventually, thank goodness, that ship directly ahead of them slowly moved off and out of the way. The Banshee restarted her engines, began moving in, but by then the night was coming to an end. A little gray was showing in the sky in the anticipation of dawn, and Taylor made out 6 or 7 Yankee gunboats. And they saw the Banshee, too. Rockets fire into the sky, ships begin to move, they all open fire, and the Banshee now has to make a run for it. Into New Inlet, into the Cape Fear River. Shell splashes erupting all around it. It was, Taylor recalled, an unpleasant sensation, and particularly so because the cargo carried by the Banshee was gunpowder. The Yankee ships were getting closer, and their shots were getting increasingly accurate. Then suddenly, the big guns from Fort Fisher boomed out, and the blockading ships peeled away. And they made it into New Inlet. Those guns, Taylor said, were music to our ears. Unwilling to challenge those big guns, Taylor's words, the ship steamed sulkily out of range, and the crew of the Banshees cheered as they made it into New Inlet. Now the Banshee, this is its first run into port. It had 3 more, right? 2 in, 2 out. 4 total runs through the blockade like that, and then was captured on her 5th try. Captured, interestingly enough, by the Armed Army Transport Fulton. It kills me to say that the Army did this, but I will refer to that later. It was holed by the 2nd shot, and the unarmed Banshee rounded to and dropped her flag. So, okay, what's interesting about this is that the Banshee can serve for us as a kind of metaphor for blockade runners generally, because despite several successful and highly profitable runs, she was eventually captured. And the number of runs she made, 4, turns out to be the exact average for blockade running ships during the Civil War. 4 was the successful number. As far as the owners were concerned, this is all good news, because it only took about 2 to make a fortune. Everything after that was gravy. Of course, every ship that escaped through the blockade, like the Banshee here in May of '63, whether running in or running out, was fodder for the opposition press in the North. And there was an opposition press in the North. Editorials in the New York papers referred to the imbecility of the Navy Department. I love that word. And of Secretary Wells in particular for not being able to stop this trade. You've got 500 ships on there. How come you can't be more efficient than you are? James Gordon Bennett, who was publisher of the influential New York Herald, was particularly virulent in his criticism of the Navy Department. The capture of the Banshee by an Army transport was absolutely delicious to him. The Banshee, he wrote, defied any ship in our Navy to catch her, but when she was at last captured, it will be noticed it was not one of our naval vessels but by an Army transport. More evidence, Bennett insisted, that Wells was as obstinate as he is ignorant, and that he should be removed at once in favor of some more competent person. But Lincoln stood by his embattled Secretary of the Navy, and the blockade, porous as it was, went on. Whatever the perception of the blockade in New York City, in much of the Confederacy, the difficulties of the Southern economy began to grow increasingly evident by the middle of 1863. Here the sacrifice was borne not only by the undersupplied armies in Butternut and Gray, but also by the civilian population. Many of the difficulties were the product, as I mentioned, of an internal transportation system that was also breaking down. But many in the South began to resent the fact that, as one contemporary put it, blockade running was fast degenerating into an illicit and unpatriotic trade. I personally find a huge irony in this next complaint. See if you can find it as well. Confederate planters protested in letters and editorials that the fabulous profits being made by blockade runners were enriching a small class of moneyed men while making little contribution to the overall war effort. How unfair is that? The Richmond Enquirer decried the unbecoming vanity demonstrated by the elaborate wardrobes of these nouveau riche merchants, unsuitable for a nation fighting for its survival. The way to curtail this disgraceful extravagance, it asserted, was for the government to impose strict regulations on trade. A few states had already moved in that direction, North Carolina being one of them. Zebulon Vance, the rather difficult wartime governor of North Carolina, initiated a state-managed program of blockade running as early as January of '63. It was designed to bring in supplies and uniforms and material and equipment that would be dedicated to soldiers from North Carolina in particular. But he got no cooperation from the Secretary of War in this program, because Seddon worried that better equipped troops from the Tar Heel state might provoke jealousy and resentment from other states. Seddon reminded Vance that it was the survival of the whole Confederacy and not just North Carolina that was at stake here, and suggested that Vance should recognize the primacy of the Richmond government. What is this states' rights stuff? What are you, some kind of rebel? I don't know. In time of war, however, and particularly in a time of survival, ideology often gives way to necessity. So despite the concern that it constituted breaking faith with the Confederacy's ideological pole star, a popular clamor for the Richmond government to take over the regulation of trade proved irresistible. And in February of 1864, Jefferson Davis pressed the Confederate Congress to pass a new law that required all outbound blockade runners to reserve half of their cargo space for government-owned cotton and to bring in half the cargoes designated and delineated by the government. Congress also passed a law forbidding the importation of luxury goods. I love this list, by the way, which I'm going to share with you. Specifically banned, see if you can tell what kind of, if there's a theme developing here. Specifically banned ale, beer, rum, brandy, billiard tables, furniture, carpeting, tapestry, carriages, lace, jewelry, dolls or toys, glass, marble, fur, hats, capes, painting, statuary, wallpaper, bricks, no bricks, roofing slates, perfume, playing cards, sinful playing cards. You know, the soldiers used to throw playing cards away on their way to a battle because playing cards were the devil's tool. Playing cards not to be velvet, or any kind of wine, including specifically champagne, claret, Madeira, port, and sherry. Well, there was considerable grousing about all this. You're telling me what to do, not only from the companies that stood to lose profit, but from state-right governors like Vance and Joe Brown of Georgia, who believed that Richmond was becoming altogether too intrusive into the lives of Southern citizens. The key question, of course, is did it work? I promised you I would try to answer this question, so here goes. And most historians who address this issue do so by appealing to statistics. It's what we've got, right? So we look at numbers. You've heard the old saw, there are liars, damn liars, and statisticians. Here's what the statisticians have to say. During the Civil War, a total of 300 different steam-powered vessels attempted to run the blockade. Now, there were some sailing ships as well, but their rate of success was very low, so steam power vessels are the way to examine this. Those steamers made an average, as I already mentioned, of 4 successful round trips per vessel. There were 1,300 attempts, 1,000 of which were successful. So, statistics prove that steam-powered blockade runners made it successfully through the blockade 77% of the time. Blockade's useless. There's another fact. Of those 300 steamers, Union warships captured 136 of them, not necessarily on the first try, but eventually 136 were captured and 85 more were destroyed, run into the shore by pursuing vessels or lost at sea, for a total of 221. Thus, statistics prove that 73% of all steam-powered ships that attempted to run the blockade were destroyed or captured. In other words, both of the following statements are true. 3/4 of all attempts to run the blockade were successful, and 3/4 of all ships that tried it were destroyed or captured. Pick one. Perhaps a more useful way to measure the impact of the blockade is to calculate how much the Confederacy was able to import during the war to sustain its economy and its war effort. It's self-evident that the Confederacy was able to import enough rifles and cannon to keep the armies in the field. During the war, the South imported 400,000 rifles. 60% of the total used were imported through the blockade. 3 million pounds of lead for making bullets, 2.5 million pounds of saltpeter, the principal ingredient of gunpowder. Without doubt, those imports were crucial to the war effort. Stephen Wise, who wrote a book about this, Lifeline of the Confederacy, is undoubtedly correct when he says that without blockade running, the nation's military would have been without proper supplies of arms, bullets, and powder. And they weren't. So perhaps it didn't work. But the fact that rebel armies managed to sustain themselves despite the blockade does not mean that its effect was not felt elsewhere. Coffee and tea became such prized luxury goods that one Atlanta jeweler famously set coffee beans into pins in place of diamonds. A little bit of an exaggeration, but makes the point. The shortage of those kinds of goods and others contributed to hoarding, speculation, huge inflation, and dramatically affected civilian morale. Moreover, in assessing the impact of the blockade, it's necessary to consider not only the impact on imports, but on exports. The Confederacy had believed prior to the war that cotton, king cotton, white gold, would be its ace card. The need for that in Europe would draw European support. It would wreck the northern economy, not getting to it. Getting that cotton out to the market was as important as getting materiel into the Confederacy. As the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for the Union, a fellow named Gustavus Fox, put it, the rebellion was sustained not by what entereth into their ports, but by what proceedeth out. Little biblical statement there, I guess. Both before and during the war, the Southern economy was almost entirely dependent on cash crops for export, and especially cotton. In the last year of peace, the 12 months prior to Fort Sumter, the cotton states exported just under 3 million bales of cotton. 3 million. In the 12 months after Fort Sumter, the first year of the war, the South exported 50,000 bales. That's less than 2% of the peacetime total. And over the next 2 years, as Union forces occupied more and more of the southern coast and the blockade became more effective, cotton exports fell further. Now, to be sure, the price of cotton went up at the same time, but even if the price of cotton rose, so too did the price of the goods that the South was attempting to buy with that cotton. Marine engines, railroad machinery, rifled cannon, breech-loading rifles, and so on. The economic historian David Serdam concludes that the shortfall in Southern revenues from exporting raw cotton rivaled, if not exceeded, the federal government's total expenditures on the Navy during the war. Given that, a simple cost-effective analysis suggests the Union blockade was certainly worth the effort. So the bottom line, I think, is this, that despite the apparently porous character of the Union blockade, the cumulative effect of the reduction in the South's cotton exports, the loss of its coastline, and eventually the occupation of its major seaports undermined the Confederate government, its economy, its civilian morale, and eventually the morale, too, of its soldiers when they got letters from home telling them that we're starving, Jake. Come home and save us. It's hard to pin down the precise effect of all that on the war, but it was real, it was progressive, and it was powerful. The sacrifices of the blockading sailors in maintaining a vigil over the southern coastline produced even greater sacrifices on the part of the southern population. If the blockade was never airtight, and it never was, it was constricting enough that the South was constantly gasping for economic breath. And that slow asphyxiation, combined with a reduction in the size of the logistic base from which the South could draw supplies for Lee's embattled army in Virginia, in the end compelled Lee's surrender. Almost certainly the North could have won the Civil War without the blockade, but it would have taken longer, would have cost more lives. And so in that respect, perhaps the blockade was the humane thing to do. And I'll stop with that controversial observation and invite your questions. Thank you very much. How's our time, Chris? It's when do you want to break off?
We've got about 10 minutes.
All right, 10 minutes. A couple of quick questions. Come on, don't be shy. This is the best part. Yes, sir.
The same with the exports, mainly to Britain, France, Belgium. Was there any research conducted at any time to determine any export practice with the Union merchants?
Whether the Union merchants were carrying cotton to those places overseas?
Or from the south to the...
Yes, there was, and particularly as the war went on. In fact, one of the key aspects of the Red River Campaign that took place in 1864 was that as the Union Army and Navy moved up the Red River, eventually to be defeated and then forced back down the Red River, but during that entire campaign, one of the reasons they were so distracted was they were so busy gathering up, gobbling up as much cotton as they possibly could. Cotton for the Navy counted as prize money. Just as you took an enemy ship at sea, I don't know if you know the protocols here, if you captured an enemy ship at sea in the age of sail, anywhere in the 19th century, you owned it. It was yours. You got to keep everything on it, and the ship itself was taken to a prize court and condemned, sold at auction, and all the money went to the ship. So there's a big incentive to be successful. But there weren't many ships at sea. There were, however, lots of cotton bales piled alongside the rivers. And the Navy people would go up and grab that and call it prize. You know, this is a prize of war, and send it to a prize court. They were all going to get rich. The bales, to make sure the prize court recognized that it was captured Confederate cotton, they stenciled CSA on it first, if it didn't already have that, to prove that it was Confederate government cotton, and then stenciled USN underneath it to make sure the Army didn't claim that they had done it. And of course all these bales would arrive at the prize court and somebody said, what's that stand for? Well, it stands for the Cotton Stealing Association of the United States Navy. The other aspect of this was that entrepreneurs would appeal to Lincoln for licenses to trade. Once sections of the Confederate coast were captured, these would-be entrepreneurs would go to Lincoln and say, you know, we will volunteer to take this cotton and take it overseas, and the government will get a share, and it's a win-win. I'll get rich, you'll get rich, the Confederates will lose their cotton. And Lincoln, perhaps unwisely, issued a number of these licenses. And it really looked like crony capitalism, because they would be the ones to get the, and of course the Navy Department said, wait a minute, don't you realize we're trying to blockade this stuff? The whole point is to keep the trade from happening at all, and you're giving licenses to people to come down here and buy cotton and take it overseas. So there was a lot of back and forth about that during the war, and the details of it got quite complicated and politically oriented as well. But the short answer to that question, you can never get a short answer, is yes, there was. Yes, ma'am.
Questions that are related. You kind of get early on to the blockade runners that it seemed like it's more entrepreneurial thing.
Right.
When did the Confederacy start contracting with the blockade runners? Was that around 1863? And how do they pay? Like, do they pay for a run from like the Bahamas back to Wilmington?
Yeah, great question. First of all, it's all entrepreneurial up to late 1863. Then the states, beginning with North Carolina, begin to enact legislation putting parameters around that. And by 1864, when the South recognizes we are now in desperate trouble, we have to do something, the Confederate government actually began mandating. They sent Confederate naval officers, commissioned officers, over to Britain to take command of the blockade runners and actually purchase or claim ownership of blockade runners that were owned by the Confederate government, taking over the private blockade running, or attempting to take over the private blockade running. So if you wanted to try to graph something like that, it became entirely entrepreneurial, became increasingly government first regulated, and then government owned and managed by the end of the war. And I think that speaks to the difficulty of trying to sustain a completely weak central government in the midst of a total war. A weak government cannot fight a total war, and the Davis administration discovered that. And obviously, the Confederacy is the first to impose a draft. There's nothing that interferes on the individual rights of citizens than saying, we claim your body for the war, and you can do nothing about it. It imposed restrictions, hoarding, and in this case, trade. So what happens during the course of the Civil War is an ideological states' rights organization becomes a very much top-directed, managed economy by 1865. Is that responsive to your question?
I think can I just
follow up? Yeah, that's why I asked.
I have to admit, I had two of my ancestors from blockade runners out of Wilmington. They were captain or pilot. And I found a receipt. I pulled my mother's UDT record. I actually found a receipt. One of them was a pilot on a ship, a steamer ship, and he was paid $200.
Yeah, pilots are different. Pilots, when these blockade runners come in peacetime, you'd pick up a pilot at the entrance, and the captain would actually give the ship over to the pilot. And the pilot would take it in because he knew the local waters and the channels and so on. And same thing going out. And the pilots never left the port. They would take a ship out, turn it over to the captain, get in a little boat, go back in, take the next ship out. Pilots were very valuable because they were paid by whoever was managing it. Early on, the entrepreneur would pay the pilot the $200 or whatever it might be. That's kind of a high salary. What year was that?
I think it was 1863.
Yeah, $200 in '61 is a lot more than $200 in '63. But in any case, the entrepreneur would pay the pilot, or by 1865, when the government is managing this trade, the government would pay him. So, but he takes his money from whoever owns the ship.
Yeah,
So pilots are different.
Yeah.
He's not really a member of the crew.
It was September 63.
Yeah.
But they also, I'm sorry, there's also another statement in here about bringing in shoes. The quartermaster needed shoes. So were they importing shoes too?
Oh, sure. Oh, anything manufactured, including shoes, because shoes, mostly in the Confederacy prior to the war, the antebellum period, shoes would be handmade unless you were importing them from New England. There weren't really a lot of shoe factories in the South. There weren't factories of any kind, really, in the South. The economy, the remuneration from cash crop agriculture was so high, why would you invest money in anything else if you could make these fabulous sums growing sugar or rice or cotton in particular? So, yeah, shoes would be among the imported items as well. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
The price of cotton before the war, and my understanding was that Europe was well supplied with a lot of cotton, and when the war began, the Confederacy thought, well, if we keep on selling this,
Yeah.
wasn't it a dramatic drop?
Yes, it's a great question about cotton and cotton prices and the inflation of cotton. What happened early on, a couple of things. Britain kind of saw this coming a little bit and had built up its stores. So that's one fact. They had a lot of cotton in the warehouses. Another factor was that because the Southerners had convinced themselves that cotton was so valuable on the world market, it would compel intervention by those who needed it. For the first 6-8 months of the war, they embargoed their own cotton. They passed a law saying nobody's allowed to export cotton. Well, you know, this was the time to get it out because that's when the blockade was weakest. They could have sent out, you know, millions of pounds of cotton in the first 6 months of the war, but they deliberately embargoed it. And when they realized, you know what, this isn't really working, okay, go ahead. By then, the blockade was getting stronger. A third factor is that the English in particular, and the British were the focus of most of this, the Belgians, French to a much lesser extent, but the British in particular, the British found alternate sources. A lot of cotton began to be grown during this time in Egypt and in India. And that's where a lot of the cotton isn't as good from India or from Egypt. Egyptian cotton's pretty good, but Indian cotton not quite as good as the American cotton. But it was available. And combined with the storage that they managed early and the alternate sources, they got by. But what's interesting is even when the scarcity of cotton led to a shutdown of cotton mills, the workers who had been laid off from work because of the scarcity of cotton nevertheless rallied for the Union. Instead of saying, well, let's go, you know, beat the Yankees so we can get Southern cotton, because they were committed to the idea certainly after the Emancipation Proclamation, that it was better that we're out of a job and that slavery die than that I have a job and slavery continue, which is quite a remarkable statement to me. Got time for another one? One more. Last question. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Can you discuss the operational aspects of a blockading squadron? For example, if you had 12 ships blockading the entrance to Wilmington, would those ships, a certain number of them remain at anchor and the rest be ready and not making way for...
Yeah, let me do this real quickly. Let me back it up just a bit. Early on, when the blockade was first established, they established something called the Blockade Board, sometimes called a Strategy Board. It was headed by DuPont, Samuel Francis DuPont. And initially, there was going to be an Atlantic blockade squadron and then a Gulf blockade squadron. Well, that was just too much territory to cover. So they were subdivided. There was a North Atlantic and a South Atlantic and an East Gulf and a West Gulf squadron. And each of those squadrons was headed by initially a flag officer, and when we established the rank of Rear Admiral, which was in 1862, the first admiral ever in the history of the United States, came during the Civil War. Those 4 admirals bureaucratically supervised that stretch of coast. In the case of Wilmington, which is in the North Atlantic Blockade section, that's from the Potomac River down to, I think it's South Carolina line. That's what I thought it was. So there'd be a rear admiral in charge of that section of it. And then for each city within that, there'd be a squadron within the section that would be commanded by a senior captain. And it might be, as you say, 8, 12, occasionally 16, or as big as 20, depending on how serious it was. Only Charleston and Wilmington had enough importance to command a squadron that size. And he would give out the daily orders. And the daily orders consisted of a certain number of ships remaining at anchored, but as soon as it was dark and they couldn't see from the port where the ships were, everybody would shift position. Because otherwise they could send signals out to sea to blockade runners coming in. You know, there's one off New Inlet, there's one on, and so on. So they would all shift position. And then there would be a few that would patrol out beyond that to catch them en route. And that had a certain legal difficulty as well, because if you captured him 100 miles off the coast, he could always say, oh, I wasn't going for Wilmington, I was headed for Halifax, which would be legal, you see. But then you'd go through his papers and look and see what he was carrying, and you'd say, no, you're a blockade runner. And they'd capture him, send him to a prize court. Now it's up to the judge to decide if this was a legitimate capture. If it's a legitimate capture, the ship is condemned and those guys get all the money. If it's not, our apologies, off you go, and here's some compensation, and so on. So each squadron head managed what the ships did, where they anchored, and they switched off back and forth. It wouldn't be the same ships on distant patrol every time. They'd move that around. And they were each within, again, a larger squadron on each of the segments of the coast. There. That's it for today, and thank you very much. I appreciate it. Have a great conference.
Well, now this is the best we could do. The only compensation you're getting for the entire weekend is a T-shirt and a hat. No. Paul Laird, the director of the Friends of Fort Fisher, kindly is giving you this.
That is very
Fort
cool.
Fisher.
You know, that's the Banshee right there.
There it is.
That's it.
Yeah.
Famous image, yeah.
So, of a blockade runner and a hat to go with.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Can I have one more minute at the mic?
Absolutely.
I just wanted to kind of a shout out here. I was standing out in the anteroom here before we came in this morning, and 2 young men approached me and told me that they had been in my very last Civil War class at the Naval Academy 10 years ago. They selected the Marine Corps upon graduation. They are now captains in the United States Marine Corps, and drove over here today to hear me give another lecture. Can you believe that? I just want to thank them for coming. John and Paul in the back row.